Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Simple 7 Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jerry Duggar. It's good to be with you today, and we're going to dive into a really cool topic, one that is critical for our overall health. We have to understand what's going on with our gut, and just about every day in my clinical practice, I have the opportunity to sit down with people who are dealing with chronic GI issues and really help them understand the relationship between their gut and everything else that's going on in their health. Now, of course, when they come in, if their chief complaint is, heartburn or diarrhea or constipation or bloating or something like that, well, they can assume that their gut is really where that's going to be coming from. But even patients who come in with depression or skin problems or fatigue or stubborn weight loss, they may not understand it at that point. It's my job to kind of teach them how the gut is related to those issues, and in fact is. So, I've blogged about the gut-brain connection and other gut-related issues many places on our website, but today I wanted to dive into this gut function thing a little bit deeper on the podcast. So we're going to talk about one specific condition, but I want to kind of set that inside of the context of the way the whole digestive system works. So let's get acquainted first with the upper GI system, okay? The upper GI tract. There's multiple organs involved in how the upper GI works. When you think about your gut, it's really one giant hollow tube from your mouth to your bottom, right? And at various places along this tube, there are little places where things get added to the mix, okay? So now it's also separated into different sections, and in those different sections, the physiology and processes that are going on are quite different. So it's helpful to think about the GI system kind of in chunks, if you will. But let's walk through top to bottom. When we take a bite of food, obviously our teeth and our saliva start working on this food and breaking it down and beginning the digestive process, move the food from our mouth into our esophagus. And at the bottom of the esophagus, there's a muscular sphincter called the lower esophageal sphincter, and that is the barrier between the esophagus and the stomach, right? And there's a totally different environment in those two places, so that barrier is really important. There's stimulation that happens, and it tells the body, hey, we need to open the portal, okay? Open the door, let's let food down into the stomach, and let's close the door again. Now, inside of the stomach, incredibly acidic environment, and these tissues are being protected by mucus linings and all sorts of things, right? But the pH of the stomach is 1.5 to maybe 2.5. It's very acidic, and that acid breaks down bacteria. It begins a process of protein digestion and triggers all the other digestive juices to be kind of secreted. And the little muscular activity of the stomach kind of moves that food around and starts to break it down. That kind of semi-liquid mass is now called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. And after a few hours kind of hanging out in the stomach, our food now exits the stomach through another portal valve, okay? And it dumps into the upper part of the small intestine, goes into this part of the small intestine, and it now triggers the release of bile from the gallbladder and pancreatic enzymes from the pancreas, right? And so we've got this added mixture of enzymes and bile salts, and all these things kind of mix in and help to further digest our food. The gallbladder is responsible for producing juices that break down fats and emulsify fats so that we can absorb them. The pancreas is noted for making a lot of enzymes that are helpful for breaking down carbohydrates. And anyway, when it's all working together and we have the best possible chance to break down all of the nutrients from our food into the smallest particles so that we can absorb these nutrients across this amazing, miraculous small intestine. Now, the small intestine is about 20 feet long. We call it small because the diameter of the tube is narrower there than it is in the large intestine. The work that takes place in the small intestine is responsible for many components of our health because that's where our nutrients are being absorbed. If we don't absorb nutrients there, we can't get nutrients to our cells. We can't make the building blocks that keep our body alive. But it's also where a lot of our immune system interacts with our outside world. There are literally trillions of bacteria that live in and on our bodies, and most of those bacteria are either, what we call commensal. They're not harmful or beneficial. Some of them are very beneficial, and a small amount could be potentially harmful or pathogenic. So there's this balance of this microbial environment in and around us, okay? But the small intestine is an area that is somewhat sterile. Now, it's not perfectly sterile. There are kind of normal bacteria that should live there, but they should be kept in check, and they shouldn't have a lot of them there. But when we create the wrong environment, and I'll get to some of the causes of what that wrong environment are, we can get an overgrowth of the bacteria in the small intestine. And this leads to a whole host of problems. The condition is called SIBO, and that's just an acronym. It stands for Small Intestinal Bacterial Overgrowth. And bacteria need to eat just like we do. In fact, that's one way bacteria help us, is that they digest food, they create vitamins and short-chain fatty acids and all sorts of helpful components that our body needs that keep us healthy. And that's great. That's supposed to happen in large amount in the large intestine. And that we talk about this microbiome a lot, right? This balance of the right bacteria in the body. But in the small intestine, if these bacteria overgrow, we start getting fermentation and digestion of our food too early. And these bacteria love to eat sugars and simple carbohydrates. And when they do, they produce their own waste products, namely gases, hydrogen, methane, and hydrogen sulfide. So 3 different types of gases can be produced by these bacteria, depending on what type of bacteria we're talking about. And when they produce this gas, it causes lots of problems. It causes obvious things like belching and farting, but it also can be a main cause of heartburn. It can also be a main trigger for constipation and diarrhea and pain, right? So a lot of people have irritable bowel syndrome, which is just a collection of symptoms that they haven't figured out what the diagnosis is for. But what we're understanding now is about 80% of irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS, is actually caused by SIBO. All right, so let's dive in and talk about a few causes of SIBO. And once we understand the physiology of what's going on, and we understand the causes, then we know exactly what to go treat, right? So one of the main causes of SIBO is low stomach acid. Now, most people don't even consider the possibility of low stomach acid. All they think about is too much stomach acid, right? But the truth of the matter is the stomach's supposed to be incredibly acidic. We want a lot of acid there. And if you don't have enough acid, it compromises digestion and also doesn't kill the bacteria that we may be eating on our food or in our food. So we can get SIBO from kind of the top down. Therefore, we would need to increase stomach acid. And you can do that by eating a better diet, by taking some bitter herbs, and also by taking supplements that have digestive enzymes and stomach acid in them. Okay, so the other thing that can cause it, in addition to low stomach acid, would be what we call poor gut motility. Now, motility just means the movement of the food through the small intestine. That's not working very well, then it's kind of stagnant. And just like a stagnant lake or pond is an amazing breeding ground for mosquitoes and bugs, much more so than a fast-flowing river is. If the gut's not moving, food's not moving through there, it becomes a really good place for these bacteria to overgrow. Now, there's a component in the small intestinal wall called a migrating motor complex, and that is a bundle of nerves that kind of stimulates the movement of the food through the small intestine. It just so happens that there are some things that can damage those nerves. One of which is actually the presence of methane gas. Okay, so if you have some methane gas, it can lead to more disruption of the migrating motor complex, which becomes a vicious cycle that leads to more and more methane gas. There's also another cause of poor migrating motor complex, and that is snacking all day long. We need about 90 minutes between food going into the small intestine for the brain signal down to the body to sweep all of that food along. So when we eat too quickly or we snack all of the time, we're not giving the body enough time to send that message to the small intestine, right? So another important reason why we should space our meals and not snack, especially on junky things that might be feeding this bacteria. Last but not least, the other issue that can affect the motility of the small intestine is actually poisoning. Now, obviously, food poisoning is something we ate. Our stomach acid wasn't able to kill it, and now it's in there. But in the response to the actual infection, the immune system can cross-react, and it can create basically an autoimmune response, and that damages and knocks out the migrating motor complex neurons. All right, so that's some pretty cool science that's just come out recently. If you've had food poisoning, you need to be very careful and watchful about chronic symptoms lingering. Obviously, when you're in the throes of the acute food poisoning, that's all you're thinking about. Stuff's going both directions and you're miserable. But even as that calms down, many people are left with lingering GI problems. They've never quite got back to normal function. And it may be that there's this autoimmune activity happening, and that's setting the stage for long-standing overgrowth. Okay, now at the other end of the small intestine, when we start getting to the place where the small intestine becomes the large intestine, we have another sphincter valve. This is called the ileocecal valve. The ICV is a barrier that doesn't allow things to go from, things are going from the small intestine to the large intestine, and the ileocecal valve shouldn't allow things to backflow, okay? But the large intestine is loaded with bacteria, right? It's just chock full, trillions and trillions of bacteria there. And if the ileocecal valve isn't working well, it's thought that some of those bacterial colonies can migrate up now into the far end of the small intestine, causing more problems. All right, so what are some other causes? Antibiotic exposure. And we need to talk about that because antibiotics wipe out a lot of the beneficial flora and the harmful flora. And if we don't do things correctly, we might not come back up with the right amount of good bacteria to keep the bad bacteria in check. So we can get SIBO after antibiotic exposure. How about other things that damage the gut and cause inflammation, like chronic gluten sensitivity? How about things that cause more fermentation, like alcohol consumption and high sugar diets? We even understand that certain birth control pills can cause SIBO, and certainly any damage to the small intestine from trauma or even from surgery that can cause scarring or adhesions that don't allow the small intestine to work properly. Now, many people have multiple causes at the same time. So just because we find one doesn't mean we found every cause of this issue. And that makes treating SIBO somewhat complex. It's not necessarily easy to treat. In some cases are very easy. You treat them once, they never come back. Lickety split, everybody's happy. But about 50 to 60% of cases, SIBO will recur. There's some underlying issue that is difficult to resolve, and so the SIBO will come back. So let's talk a little bit about how to diagnose SIBO. There's a gold standard way, which is to put something down into the small intestine and aspirate some of the fluids there and put it on a culture and measure. That's so inconvenient and invasive, and it's just only done really in research facilities. There is a much easier way to test this, and that is to measure the amounts of these gases, hydrogen, methane, and hydrogen sulfide, in our breath. There's only one company that I know of right now that actually tests all three gases, but many, many companies test the main two gases, which are hydrogen and methane. So you have to get a test kit. You have to follow a prep diet for a day and then fast overnight. And we take multiple breath samples over the course of 3 hours. And we're measuring the amount of gas that's being expelled in your breath. And that's reflective of what's happening in the small intestine. So that is the way to diagnose it. You can't diagnose SIBO from a stool test. You can't diagnose it in really any other way. You have to get a breath test. Okay, so let's say we've got a positive test and we've got methane and hydrogen in high amounts. So we know there's an overgrowth in the small intestine. What are we going to do to treat it? Well, there are 3 main treatments. So let's dive into treatment here. Number 1, a specific prescription antibiotic. Now, I said antibiotics in general can cause SIBO, but there's a particular antibiotic that actually is great for treating SIBO and doesn't have any negative side effects on the rest of the microbiome. Well, that sounds like a total win, right? There are a few caveats here. This antibiotic is called rifaximin, and the problem is it's only been FDA approved for treating IBS with diarrhea. So it's not approved if you actually just have a diagnosis of SIBO, which is weird because that's what it treats. And it's not approved if you don't have diarrhea. So if you've got constipation, even though rifaximin would be part of the treatment, it's not approved for that. The other issue is that it's really expensive, and so most insurance companies don't want to pay for it. And, so we're talking well over $1,000 for a 2-week regimen. So those are the downsides with rifaximin, but the studies are pretty impressive. Okay, so if we can't use that, what else can we do? Well, there's another approach called the elemental diet. Now, the elemental diet, a liquid diet broken down to just the key elements of nutrition. So that is simple sugars, amino acids, and fats, and some vitamins and minerals. So it's basically a shake or a liquid diet with some sugar, some protein and amino acids, some medium chain triglycerides or fats, and some vitamins and minerals in there. And that's all you get to eat for 2 to 3 weeks. So it's incredibly effective, but it's difficult for many people to do. We've had good success treating people with elemental diet, but it can be pretty tedious and mind-numbing and drives people a little crazy to not have any solid food for 2 to 3 weeks. But this is an option that comes into play for certain people. Okay, last but not least, there are some amazing herbs that have been used traditionally to treat gut problems that have now been studied in the realm of SIBO. And these are incredibly effective, equally effective as rifaximin in most studies, and equally effective with the elemental diet. It takes a little bit longer to treat with these herbs, but they're more gentle on the body generally. So herbs like berberine, artemisia, neem, oregano, an extract from garlic called allicin, and then other nutrients like digestive enzymes and biofilm disrupting enzymes, beneficial probiotics, specifically spore-based probiotics, I found to be very helpful. There's a little bit of a controversy about probiotics in SIBO cases. Some people don't tolerate them well, but my experience has been that spore-based probiotics are well tolerated and helpful. And there's also a very specific fiber that we use called PHGG, or partially hydrolyzed guar gum. So anyway, there's various ways to combine these herbs to get the effect that we're looking for. And you do have to understand whether you're dealing with hydrogen only or hydrogen and methane or hydrogen sulfide so that you know which of these herbs to use. There's a little bit of an art to treating with these herbs. Now, I've already mentioned that treating SIBO can be difficult. It may take multiple rounds of different approaches. So some people might start with a herbal approach and that clears most of it, or it clears it and then it comes back and they may now try the elemental diet, that sort of thing. So you may have to work through treatment multiple times and multiple rounds. And so it gets kind of frustrating and you need somebody to hold your hand and guide you through this, somebody with experience in this treatment, because if not, it just gets very frustrating. Most patients don't do well with a do-it-yourself DIY approach to treating SIBO. Now, diet is also another key factor and has to be involved in the treatment at all times. So we want to lower the amount of fermentable foods that these bacteria can work on, right? So if we can adopt something called a low FODMAP diet, or there's a cedar cyanide SIBO diet, there's another diet called the specific carbohydrate diet, and also a diet called the GAPS diet. And these are all things you can find online. We prefer to use a low FODMAP diet when we're treating our patients. But basically, that will help to kind of lower the burden on the body and help the patient feel better and improve symptoms quickly while we're doing the treatment. So you have to understand that there's a lot of pieces, a lot of moving parts to SIBO, and the proper diagnosis, the proper treatment, and really the proper lifestyle that needs to support that. Okay, so today's episode, I'm just going to admit, was a little bit deep in the science, and hope it wasn't too much. You might want to listen to this again. If you know somebody who's got a chronic GI problem, this would be a great episode to share. When it comes to it, you just need to know there's millions and millions of people who are dealing with chronic GI problems. And I mean, I see patients who have dealt with SIBO for 40, 50 years with no results because they didn't know what it was. And they're frustrated and they just think that's the way their whole life is going to be. And they've figured out ways to adapt, but they're not functioning well. So if you know somebody who's got a chronic GI issue, heartburn, reflux, diarrhea, constipation, if you have a loved one who is popping Tums at a family party, or you have a spouse who spends 40 minutes in the bathroom every day, this is the sort of conversation that needs to take place. Give them some options of things to look for, and let's get this properly diagnosed and properly treated. You know, the fact of the matter is we all have way too much to do in our lives to be sidelined by chronic gut problems. And so I hope this episode has kind of helped you understand what may be driving IBS. So well beyond just saying, hey, you've got IBS, good luck. No, we can diagnose this and treat it appropriately and resolve this in a lot of situations. So that's it for today. I hope this has been helpful. And until next time, let's all go out and do some good in the world today.